Thank you so much for your audience, and thank you for listening in today. We're going to focus on biology, Darwin, and the Bible. And Charles Darwin in 1859 famously wrote The Origins of Species, and we're going to be covering a lot of that here in section 1. So with evolution, there's really 3 strands of evolution. We have biological evolution, geologic evolution, and astronomy. And today, in this series, we're going to focus on exclusively biology. And what does Scripture have to say about this? Well, in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, Scripture says, though one may be overpowered, 2 can defend themselves. A cord or a strand of 3 is not quickly broken. So why are these topics important? Well, number 1, for every human being to be able to decipher what is true and what is false, it's important to our human existence, our worldview. But more specifically, as Christians, it's critical for us to decipher what is true and what is false. It affects everything. Secondly, in evangelism, for Christians, when we're talking about the gospel to the unbelieving world, it's important to recognize that there are a lot of people that do not believe the Bible is credible because of biological evolution. But also for people that are believers, that are Christians, we constantly are bombarded with evolutionary theory and in museums and books, and this raises lots of questions about the credibility of the Bible. So these are important topics. And then third, and I would suggest the most important reason why we want to cover this, is to give God the glory that He deserves for His creation and His design. So the purpose, first, is looking at the doctrine of created kinds and the doctrine of made in His image. These are major issues that conflict with Darwinian evolution, theologically, scientifically, logically, and historically. However, there is not a war raging between science and religion. It is a battle of ideas concerning the credibility of the Bible and scientific naturalism and materialism. Countless young Christians have what are called deconstructed their faith due to Darwinian evolution. But it's time to turn the tables, and as Christians, let's study the steps of deconstructing Darwinian evolution. Because God deserves the glory for His creation, His design, not nature. This is a 4-part series. This is the first section. It's Biology 1, Biology, Darwin, and the Bible. My name is Jason Gardner, and I am not a scientist. So I'm going to be relying heavily on over 34 credentialed PhDs from areas of genetics to cell and developmental biology, chemistry, zoology, and the list goes on, from numerous different institutes. Very smart people. But before we start to cover the main body of the presentation, I do want to cover just 3 points. Number 1 is what's called junk DNA. How many of us have heard in the past junk DNA? Fantastic. So since the 1970s, scientists and researchers studying the human DNA, they recognized that only about 3% of the human DNA actually coded for proteins. But 97% of the human DNA, in their eyes, back in the 1970s, didn't do anything. And so what they recognized this to be is a proof positive of evolution. Because this 97% of human DNA was vestigial. It was vestige of the past, no longer necessary. So through the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, well into the 2000s, atheists would use this as proof positive, the apex of evolutionary theory, showing that evolution is true. Francis Collins, who is the founder of Biologos, used this in his book, Language of God, in 2006. The most famous atheist that I know, Richard Dawkins, used this all the way up until 2010. Well, what happened in 2010? Well, those researchers that were researching the human DNA recognized that 97% of human DNA was actually functional, and it actually had multiple things going on. So from 2010 onwards, all the skeptics stopped using junk DNA as an argument. Number 2 is vestigial organs. How many of us have heard over the years vestigial organs? I know I have. I've heard of the appendix, our tonsils, our tailbone. All of these different examples are numerous in the literature and in museums and textbooks, saying that these are proof positive of evolution. But things like the appendix all the way up until 2015, where researchers found that the appendix actually has multiple functions. For instance, the appendix has good bacteria in it that works with our immune system to keep us healthy. Now, it is true you can remove the appendix and still live, but there are functions that are happening in all of these different vestigial organs. So the terminology of vestigial organs is actually not true anymore. And then lastly is chimpanzee DNA, 99% similar to humans. How many of us have heard that over the years? Yes, many of us, right? Well, did you know that new research shows that human and chimp Y chromosomes are 95% different? Well, that changes a lot of things. And over the last decade or so, genetics researchers have found that the chimp DNA and the human DNA are as different as up to 16% different. Now you might ask, Jason, 16% difference, that's not a big deal. It's a huge deal because according to researchers and geneticists, in order for chimps to have evolved into human beings, that 99% is critical. Anything less, and the whole house of cards of evolving from apes to mans falls apart genetically. So can science be wrong? Now, I just want to preface, I'm not against science. I think science is awesome, and science can be used to glorify God and for us to understand different elements of how God designed all the world and biology around us. But science can be wrong in times in history. For instance, up until the 1500s, scientists, humans, believed that instead of the sun being the center of our solar system, the Earth was the center of the solar system. This is the geocentric model. And so in the 1500s, astronomers and physicists recognized, hey, we think actually the sun is the center of our solar system. And everybody changed their mind going forward. Up until the 1600s, people believed that if mice could come from soggy underpants in a bucket. Now hear me out. Where am I going with this? Well, there was this concept of spontaneous generation of life, that non-life could turn into life. And so, for instance, if you had a sweaty pair of underpants, I'm quoting the scientists back then, and put it in an open bucket in the corner and left it there for 21 days, after 21 days, miraculously, mice would appear in the bucket. Up until the 1600s, people believed that that was a biogenesis, that life came from non-life. But in the 1600s, scientists did various experiments to show that is not the case. And this carried on into the 1700s, where we had meat, maggots, and flies. People believed that if you left meat in a bucket for a period of time, that you would have non-life spontaneously generate from the meat, and maggots and flies would appear. Well, that was proven wrong in the 1700s. In the 1800s, we had the concept of bleeding. The belief that bloodletting gets out bad blood and lets you heal more quickly. And this is how George Washington died. You can see on the slide a picture of famously George Washington on his deathbed, and the doctors of the time letting out bad blood, as they called it. Some people joke that if they hadn't have let out the bad blood of George Washington, he would still be alive today. The fifth concept of science can be wrong at times is up until the 1900s, everybody believed that the universe was static. It wasn't changing. It wasn't expanding. It wasn't contracting. It just had always existed, an eternal universe. But what happened was in 1917 into the 1920s, people like Albert Einstein and Edward Hubble recognized that the physics was wrong. They actually noticed in the 1920s that the universe was actually not just expanding, but it was expanding greater and greater in speed, which suggested that the universe didn't always exist, it was not eternal, but actually there was a beginning. Fantastic. The famous evolutionary theorist, Dr. Jablonski, famously said in 1973, nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. Interesting. If you used AI to basically Google, what are the top 5 evidences of evolution in 2025? I used Microsoft Copilot and Google's Gemini AI and got almost verbatim responses from both. Number 1, the top evidence is the fossil record, which we will be talking a lot in this series about. Number 2 is comparative anatomy, specifically homology and vestigial organs. We already kind of talked a little bit about vestigial organs. Number 3 is the geographical elements of things like the Galapagos finches as evidence of biological evolution. Number 4 is embryology, or the famous Ernst Haeckel gill slits, which we'll be talking about here shortly. Number 5, DNA. That human to chimp DNA is 98.9 to 99% identical. Well, we've talked about that already in emerging genetics research. Additionally, Gemini led with this statement, quote, "The theory of evolution is supported by overwhelming amounts of evidence from diverse fields of study." We're going to get into all of this. But let's do a little bit of a historical background. I want to introduce you to William Paley. He lived in the 1700s, and of course Charles Darwin, who lived in the 1800s. These two men have had profound impact on humanity. William Paley in the 1700s wrote his famous book, Natural Theology. And what he did in that book is he talked about a watch. He said if you were walking through a desert or a forest and stumbled across a rock, you could use naturalistic interpretations of how that rock got there. But if you were walking through that same desert or forest and stumbled across a watch, you would just innately understand that somebody designed that watch, that watch had not only a designer, an architect, but it had a purpose, and it had very complex parts in the watch. You wouldn't think that naturalistic forces would have created the watch. Well, this book that William Paley wrote, Natural Theology, was required reading to enter one of the premier universities of the day, Cambridge University. So along comes a young Charles Darwin who's going off to university, Cambridge. So he read William Paley's book, and he said in his words, "I could have almost formally said it by heart." So Charles Darwin knew Paley's arguments of design almost by heart. But while he was studying Bible in Cambridge, he immersed himself in William Paley's theology and philosophy. But when Darwin left Cambridge and went on to his famous 5-year voyage around the world, he got on board the HMS Beagle with 2 books, his Bible and a newly printed 1830 book called Principles of Geology, written by Charles Lyell. He completely devoured that book. Within a couple of days, he had read the 500-page book, and he said his brain had completely switched, which I call the big switch. Darwin's Origins of Species theory, then later published in 1859, rests on 4 pillars, which we're going to cover in this class. This is Dr. Jonathan Wells. He has 2 PhDs, one in theology and one in microbiology, a really smart guy, so I'm going to just quote him. He said, in 1859, Charles Darwin proposed the minor variations within existing species are preserved or eliminated by natural selection, survival of the fittest, and that given enough time, this process generates new species, organs, and body plans. Darwin argued that variations and selection are unguided, so the results of evolution are left to the working out of what he called chance. Darwin said, there seems to be no more design in the variability of organic beings and in the action of natural selection than in the course of which the wind blows. Darwin described his famous book, The Origins of Species, as one long argument. It was basically an argument against creation by design, and it took the following form. The facts of biology are inexplicably on the theory of creation, but make sense on his theory of descent with modification. Starting with the 4th edition of his book, Darwin went further and argued that the idea of living things were created according to a plan is not a scientific explanation. Design was, as it were, ruled out of court by definition, rather than by the evidence. It is often claimed that people in the 19th century were converted to Darwin's theory because he provided so much evidence for it. But this is not true. For one thing, Darwin could offer no evidence for natural selection, only 1 or 2 imaginary illustrations. And despite the title of his most famous book, he failed to explain the origin of species. People were converted to Darwin's theory mainly because it fit the increasing materialistic tenor of the times. Historian Neil Gillespie wrote that it is sometimes said that Darwin converted the scientific world to evolution by showing them that the process by which it occurred. Yet, the uneasy reservations about natural selection among Darwin's contemporaries and the widespread rejection of it from 1890s to the 1930s suggest that this is too simple a view of the matter. It was more Darwin's insistence on total natural explanations than on natural selection that won their adherents. This is in 1861, 2 years after Charles Darwin published his Origins of Species. In 1861, the Secretary of the French Academy of Sciences, this guy's the top guy in France at the time of all sciences, and this is what he said. Finally, Mr. Darwin's work appeared. One cannot help but be struck by the author's talent. But how many obscure ideas, how many false ideas, what metaphysical jargon inappropriately thrown into natural history, which falls into gibberish as soon as it strays from clear and sound ideas. What pretentious and empty language, what childish and outdated personifications. O clarity, O solidity of French mind, where have you gone? I think he's trying to make a point. Dr. Jonathan Wells also concludes, before Darwin, Christianity and science got along quite well, despite what many people think. Indeed, the founders of most modern disciplines in biology and other scientific fields, such as chemistry and physics, they were Christians. The false idea that religion and science have always been at war with each other was promoted in 2 books written in the late 1800s by Darwin followers who were hostile to Christianity. There was never a war between religion and empirical science, but there is a war between religion and materialistic science. The battleground is evolution. So when we talk about biological evolution, we tend to put them into 2 buckets. You have macroevolution over here on one side and microevolution. I just want to kind of define this for just a second. Macro means large, so large changes over time. So you basically see molecules to man. You see sort of trilobites evolving, according to the theory, into fish, and then into reptiles, and then into mammals, and so forth. This is macro. These are large changes over long periods of time. Microevolution tends to be defined as within a certain kind. So, for instance, we're all familiar with dogs. We have different varieties of dogs, and some people would term this microevolution. But let's see what Scripture says. According to the doctrine of created kinds. In Genesis chapter 1, Scripture says, "Then God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth after their kind. And it was so. God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground after its kind. And God saw that it was good." In Genesis chapter 1, God uses the phraseology of after its kind over 10 times. And then in chapter 8 of Genesis, "So Noah came out together with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives, all the animals of all the creatures that move along the ground and all the birds. Everything that moves on the land came out of the ark, one kind after another." Let's define terms. Whenever we're looking at some sort of maybe controversial topic, I always think it's important to define terms. So if we look at the difference between creation versus the definition of nature, according to dictionary.com, I think an objective source, creation is defined as the act of producing or causing to exist, the act of creating, the fact of being created, something that is or has been created, the creation, the original bringing into existence of the universe by God. The word universe, creatures collectively, an original product of the mind, especially imaginative artistic work, specifically designed. Now, if we juxtapose that with nature, nature is the material world, especially as surrounding humankind and existing independently of human activities. The elements of the natural world, such as mountains, trees, animals, or rivers, natural scenery. So for me, my experience with the definition of nature has always been this picture over here on the slide, which is you've got your mountains, your rivers, your trees. That is nature, but it can't do anything. God created it, but it can't do anything. Let's define terms of observational science versus historical science. So with observational science, Sir Francis Bacon, who first proposed the scientific method in 1620, defined observational science as observable, repeatable, and testable science in the present. Whereas historical science, I'm going to quote the famous evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr. He has argued that while empirical observational sciences seek universal laws through repeatable experiments, historical sciences like evolution aim to reconstruct past events, such as the origin of species, based on available evidence. In this view, evolutionary biology is more akin to the fields like geology or astronomy, where scientists piece together narratives from clues left behind. So we're going to define evolution in what I call the 4 pillars. So if you study evolutionary theory, you're going to see these 3 or 4 different definitions or a combination of them. Number 1 is change over time, and long periods of time are essential for this concept of change over time. Number 2 is survival of the fittest. Number 3 is natural selection, or random and unguidedness. And then number 4 is common descent. And you can see this and follow along in your handout. So we're going to cover in these first 3 sessions of this series macro or large change evolution in series 1 through 3. And we're going to basically be doing a ground clearing operation. But then in the final session, session 4, we're going to set the stage for a new paradigm of biological theory and really kind of jump into microevolution. So as I said, there's 4 pillars, so let's dig into the first pillar, which is change over time, long time, with macroevolution. So I talked about the fossil record and AI suggesting that this is the chief reason why evolution is true in 2025. Let's see what Darwin had to say. In 1859, Darwin knew at his present history, the fossil record did not convey a progression of development over time. So what did he do? He punted. This is what he said. Why, if species have descended from other species by fine graduations, do we not everywhere see innumerable transitional forms? Why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers of the crust of the earth? And so he punted. He said, I can answer these questions and objections only on the supposition that the geologic record is far more imperfect than most geologists believe. Only a small portion of the world has been geologically explored. So he recognized back in 1859, the geologists had only explored just a tiny piece of the earth when it comes to the fossil record. So he just thought, maybe in the future, people will be able to vindicate me. Why then is not every geologic formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged. The explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geologic column. There is no missing link. So this is the famous Stephen Jay Gould. He was a famous professor of paleontology. He's since passed away, but he said back in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, all paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major groups are characteristically abrupt. When the late Louis Leakey, an anthropologist of world renown, lectured at the University of the Pacific in Stockton, California in February of 1967, he was asked regarding the missing link. He responded, there is no one missing link. There are hundreds of missing links. Given, and this is Ernst Mayr, I'm quoting, in 2001, given the fact of evolution, one would expect the fossils to document a gradual, steady change from ancestral forms to the descendants. But this is not what the paleontologists find. Instead, he or she finds gaps in just about every phylogenetic series. The discovery of unbroken series of species changing gradually into descending species is very rare. This is another evolutionary professor, Dr. Stanley, in 1981, saying, in fact, the fossil record does not convincingly document a single transition from one species to another. This is another evolutionary professor, Dr. Roop, in 1979. Well, we now are about 120 years after Darwin, and the knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. We now have 250,000 fossil species, but the situation hasn't changed much. The record of evolution is still surprisingly jerky, and ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. Well, Darwin said he didn't have any, and this is Dr. Roop saying we have less. Again, Dr. Gould says, the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists and is a trade secret in paleontology. In any local area, a species does not arise gradually by a steady transformation of its ancestors. It appears all at once fully formed. So what we have is empirical evidence that dogs are still dogs and cats are still cats. We can see that the wolf has maybe transitioned to the coyote, to the dingo, to the collie, to the bulldog, to the poodle. Nobody would disagree that these are all dogs, the doctrine of created kinds. Or with cats, we have small cats, large cats, hairy cats, cats with no hair, but they're all cats. We see this with elephants. We have big elephants, little elephants, elephants with no tusks, elephants with huge tusks, elephants with hair and no hair. We see this with the created kinds of bears. We have different bears. We see this also in the plant kingdom with different fruits and trees and seeds after their created kind. According to genetics, the dog kind can never go back to the gray wolf due to a loss of genes in the gene pool. So you see, the ancestor to all dogs would have been some sort of common ancestor, some sort of gray wolf. This is Dr. Georgia Purdom. She has a PhD in genetics, and this is what she has to say. Within the dog kind, there are lots of different breeds with all these different varieties, long ears, long hair, short hair, etc. Surely there is genetic information being added to convey those traits. But when we observe this at a genetic level, that is just not the case. What we are seeing is variations on those traits of those organisms that they already had. The genes that code for fur in a dog will produce fur, long, short, different colors, things like that. But they are never going to become wings. They are never going to become feathers. They are not going to change like that because they do not have that information to be able to do that. And there simply is no genetic mechanism that allows you to add information you need to allow evolution to occur. And this is obvious in our experience. For instance, if I was asked a 5-year-old boy or girl, hey, which one of these 4 do not look like the rest? We have a banana and 3 dogs. Every 5-year-old is going to tell me, Mr. Jason, the banana is not like the rest. We instinctively know the doctrine of created kinds. Let's look at the Cambrian explosion, or what Darwin talked about sudden appearance. One class of facts, however, namely the sudden appearance of new and distinct forms of life in our geologic formations, supports at first sight the belief in abrupt development. But, Darwin said, the value of this evidence depends entirely on the perfection of the geologic record in relation to periods remote in history of the world. And what was he talking about when he's talking about sudden appearance, or what we now refer to as the Cambrian explosion? Well, if we look at the geologic column, if you look at all these periods, if you start at the top and work your way down, you have all of these different periods. And you get all the way down to the Pliocene, and you get down to what's called the Cambrian rock at about 550 million years. Well, what you'll notice over on the left side of the geologic column is there's no living matter below the Cambrian. It's called the Precambrian rock, all the way deep down after 550 million years. But as you move up through the stratum, when you get to that Cambrian level, we have this explosion of life in the Cambrian rock. Most of the life forms exploded from nothing into something. And so this is what Darwin called the sudden appearance of life. He said, the abrupt manner in which the whole groups of species suddenly appear in certain formations has been urged by several paleontologists, for instance, Dr. Agassiz, Pache, and Sedgwick, as a fatal objection to the belief in the transmutation of species. Darwin is recognizing here in this quote that the geologists of his day are saying, Darwin, this doesn't work. The geology, the fossil record is showing your theory does not work. In numerous species belonging to the same genre or families have really started into life at once, the fact would be fatal, Darwin said, to his theory of evolution through natural selection. And Darwin also said, I allude to the manner in which species belonging to several of the main divisions of the animal kingdom suddenly appear in the lowest known phosphorescence record. So Darwin knew this was a big problem. We also see what's called stasis, or living fossils. I love this book. This was written by Dr. Carl Warner. He's a medical doctor. Him and his wife have traveled all over the world. They've gone to over 45 dig sites, over 120 museums all over the world, have extensively interviewed over 100 different experts in different fields. And what they have found, and they published in this book, Living Fossils, is they have these these records of these animals that lived way, way, way long ago, apparently, and they're still the same. So let me show you an example of this. And the problem with biological evolution with stasis is what we're meant to see in the rock record is we're meant to see animals that lived and went extinct, or lived and then would change over millions of years into other animals. But what does the evidence show? So I'm going to show you the nautilus. He's swimming along right here. He was meant to have lived in the late Jurassic about 200 million years ago. The problem is the nautilus can be found today in oceans like the Pacific, and they look exactly the same. They have been in stasis. They haven't evolved or changed at all, one iota. We have the mantis shrimp here. That little guy was meant to have lived and passed away 340 million years ago. That's not the case. As a scuba instructor, I have often scuba dived with the mantis shrimp. They're fantastic and beautiful. And then we have the famous coelacanth. The coelacanth was found back in the 1930s. He wasn't meant to be alive. He was meant to have lived and gone extinct 410 million years ago. Or at least even if he didn't have gone extinct, he would have morphed into another creature. That's not the case. The fossil record is showing stasis. You can actually go scuba diving in certain parts of Madagascar with these coelacanths today. In 1996, Dr. Michael Behe published the work Darwin's Black Box. And in that, he proposed an idea of what's called irreducibly complex. He says irreducibly complex systems cannot be the result of natural selection, which kicks in only after the basic function is in place. He uses a metaphor of the mousetrap, which I can identify with very visually, is that every single piece of a mousetrap is essential. If you take away, for instance, the cheese, you're not going to catch less mice. You're not going to catch any mice. If you take away the wooden base, the whole thing collapses like a house of cards. If any part of the mechanism of the mousetrap is too large or too small or made from a different material, it's not going to work. It's irreducibly complex. So that's part one. Let's look at part two, or pillar number two of the definition of evolution, which is survival of the fittest, which according to Darwin's theory is completely random and completely unguided. So the survival of the fittest, the phrase was coined by a sociologist, Herbert Spencer, in his 1864 book, Principles of Biology, to describe Darwin's theory of natural selection. So this would have been 5 years after Origins of Species was written and published. Darwin used the phrase survival of the fittest in his 1869, his 5th edition of Origins of Species, but considered it a synonym to natural selection. But some evidence is that there's a lot of problems with this concept of survival of the fittest. Number one, it's circular reasoning. So the fittest survived. Well, how do you know that they were the fittest? Well, because they survived. But then you can very quickly, in logic, go around in circles. If then, if then, if then. And this is circular reasoning. It's also a tautology, which is a fallacious argument according to the Encyclopedia Britannica. And some examples of a tautology with survival of the fittest are, well, the survivors survived, or the fit were the fittest, or the fittest were the fit. And you're just continually with this tautology going around in circles. Another example of this would be in Texas. We had a hurricane that took out all these houses on the beach, except for one house that survived. So it begs the question in biological theory, was this the fittest house? Was it random and guided? All the neighborhood got obliterated except for this one house just by chance and randomness? Or would a better explanation, or the best explanation, be that the architect for this surviving house used reinforcing rebar and different kinds of concrete, and that house was raised above the incoming tide and floodwaters, whereas the surrounding houses that didn't survive had different architecture, different design that didn't hold up? It is a death-driven philosophy. So survival of the fittest is a death-driven philosophy. It is a truly dog-eat-dog world. When I hear the term survival of the fittest, my brain goes to my 6th grade biology class that talks about the lions. Only the fittest survive. The weak will die off. Death is the most necessary component of survival of the fittest. Death is essential, and in evolutionary theory, it actually is the savior of the plot. Dr. Janet Brown, the professor of history of science at Harvard University, said, Darwin was working on a theory that requires death. This theory of natural selection is built into the idea that the unfit are going to die, that they are not going to contribute to the next generation. The famous Carl Sagan said, "The secrets of evolution are death and time, the deaths of enormous numbers of life forms that were imperfectly adapted." The philosophy of survival of the fittest has deep ties to eugenics in the United States and in Europe during the 1920s and 30s and 40s. Additionally, Margaret Sanger, who's the founder of Planned Parenthood, was an ardent proponent of survival of the fittest, and her colleagues detested Christianity that sought out to help the weak, the blind, what they called the unfit, and those in need. They were using words that Darwin had penned in 1859. It is a death-driven philosophy because it requires millions of years. It requires the fossil record to have millions of years of pain, death, killing, disease, suffering in order for the chosen to survive. This is Dr. Randy Galuza. He's president of the Institute of Creation Research. I just want to watch a quick video clip of him speaking for 2 minutes on survival of the fittest.
So Darwin had to introduce into his theory, and this is why he was a very thoughtful guy. He's building a whole theory to explain things, not just survival of the fittest. He's putting together a whole theory. He needs a trajectory to go from simple to complex, and that's what Malthus does for him, because he says basically in any generation there are more offspring born than resources available to them.
Which is not biologically true, but anyways.
But that's exactly right. And the offspring are competing with each other, which also clarifies something you said earlier, which people interpret as natural selection, but really isn't. When you see a cheetah running down a gazelle, and it overtakes the gazelle and eats it, you say, oh, natural selection just happened. Wrong. That isn't what Darwin was conceiving of at all. He was not conceiving of cheetah versus gazelle. He's considering cheetah versus cheetah and gazelle versus gazelle, so that the offspring are competing for these resources, and in this case it might be cheetahs or something else, and therefore only the best of the best will get the resources, and of their offspring the best of the best will get them, and of their offspring the best, so that over time you end up with some upward and onward trajectory.
So it was a way to add direction so you can get from fish to philosopher.
Exactly, to direction to what could be considered just a random haphazard process, which could be fluctuating back and forth, back and forth. He wants to introduce a trajectory to it, and Malthus fills the bill.
Genetic entropy shows that life is not getting better over time, but it's actually getting worse. So in 2005, Dr. Sanford wrote the book Genetic Entropy. And his basic thesis is evolutionary theory states that life is getting better over time. Survival of the fittest is pruning out the weak and the sick. But genetics is not showing that. Actually, what is happening with genetic mutations is completely the opposite. So with genetic mutations, what are happening is it's copying errors. And every generation, there are copying errors. These are negative mutations, neutral at best, according to his words. And he has a PhD in genetics from Cornell, so I think he knows what he's talking about when it comes to genetics. And what he's saying is that over time, what is happening with life is because it's getting worse and worse and worse with all of these genetic copying errors, that we have a shelf life of human beings. And in the book, he actually quotes another geneticist who is a secular scientist that cannot understand how humans have lived for apparently hundreds of thousands of years because of these negative mutations that are occurring in the human genome. And it also, all of this begs the question, why aren't all the fittest perfect by now? If survival of the fittest has been weeding out the weak, the sick, and the diseased for hundreds of thousands, even millions of years, why haven't we hit apex yet? Why do we still have sickness and weakness and death? Theologically, death is the enemy. In 1 Corinthians, Paul says the last enemy to be destroyed is death. So death is not our friend. Survival of the fittest, it's a secular mindset of morality. By definition, it is godless. It is a selfish struggle to survive. As famous Richard Dawkins called it in his book, it's the selfish gene. with this mindset, how should we treat classmates, coworkers, other people in general? If we're number one, that's how we should operate. It's might that makes right, which led to World War II, Nazi Germany, and Imperial Japan. It has led to genocide and Holocaust, communism and Marxism philosophy. Karl Marx loved Darwin's theory of evolution. It is a secular mindset, and this is an evolutionary biologist, Dr. Su, that said, "We were victims of a cruel social ideology that assumes that competition among individual classes, nations, or races is a natural condition of life, and that it is also natural for the superior to dispose of the inferior. For the last century or more, this ideology has been thought to be a natural law of science, the mechanism of evolution, which is formulated most powerfully by Charles Darwin in 1859. And just to quote Dr. Sanford once again, he also proposed in 2005 in his book, Genetic Entropy, that nature does not always select the fittest. Often it is not survival of the fittest, but it's survival of the luckiest. He said, being hit by a truck or killed in war has little to do with a person's genetic fitness. So as an example, if we have this big whale and he's swimming along and he's eating everything in front of him, he's not eating necessarily the sick and the weak, he's eating all of it. So it's not necessarily the survival of the fittest, it's survival of the luckiest. But let's see what the literature has to say with this. So this is just a magazine, The Week, and it's saying that evolutionary change is sometimes as simple and unpredictable as the roll of the dice. And it's got a four-leaf clover of luck there with Darwin. Evolution has been known as survival of the fittest. However, the fittest may also have been simply the luckiest. Though genetics are a driving force of evolution, many evolutionary changes were a result of random occurrences or being at the right place at the right time. Survival of the luckiest. Wait, what? I've never really heard about this. This is NPR reporting in 2025. Survival of the luckiest? ? New study hints at a potential role of luck in evolution. For many, evolution boils down to a simple phrase, survival of the fittest. Within a population, individuals vary in their ability to survive and reproduce, and the winners of this competition shape the next generation. Everywhere we look, outcomes across populations are unequal, according to an evolutionary biologist at Cornell. The natural populations, there's a huge amount of variation in the starting position in terms of the individual's environment and genetics. Biologists usually focus on genetic and environmental causes of this variation, but sometimes organisms just get lucky. A male ram battling for a female's attention might face a rival and accidentally slip on a loose rock and tumble to his death. Or a foraging bird may happen upon a bonanza of food before others just by chance. This is the New Scientist magazine saying that natural selection is sometimes summed up as survival of the fittest. This is true, but can be misleading. The word fittest does not necessarily refer to physical fitness. Rather, it means how well suited an organism is to its environment and lifestyle. The fittest organisms are not necessarily the fastest or the strongest. Often, they're most cooperative. So now we're getting into luck and into friendly. Evolution is also chaotic, meaning that the change it produces are not always predictable. But I thought science needs to be predictable. So all of this research that I've stumbled across is just fascinating. It's showing me that there's a lot more going on with survival of the fittest. Let's look at pillar number 3, which is the breeder, or natural selection, which Darwin said is unguided and random. So the breeder analogy that nature selects, natural selection, is really a mystical concept. Nature was personified. It was given divine powers of selection, of choice, of adaptation. Nature selects at its choosing. The definition of what natural selection has been deeply disputed by evolutionary scientists since Darwin first wrote Origins of Species. Even his collaborator, Wallace, asked him to drop the term selection because of what the word conveyed. This is famous evolutionary theorist and professor Dr. Fatima back in 2013 saying, natural selection is a simple concept, but it is perhaps the most important idea in biology. It is also one of the most important ideas in the history of human thought, for it explains the apparent design of living world without recourse to a supernatural, omnipotent designer. And this is Dr. William Densky. He is a design proponent. He said Darwin's claim to fame was to argue that natural forces, lacking any purposeness or provision of future possibilities, likewise have the power to choose via natural selection. In ascribing the power to choose to unintelligent natural forces, Darwin perpetuated the greatest intellectual swindle in the history of ideas. Nature has no power to choose. Darwin, in his own words, said is unguided and random. So is it unguided natural selection? Is nature unguided, but it's doing selecting? Or is nature guiding the selection? It sounds like Darwin wanted it both ways. Though nature grants long periods of time for the work of natural selection, she does not grant an indefinite period. Slow though the process of selection may be, if feeble man can do much by artificial selection, I can see no limit to the amount of change, to the beauty and complexity of the co-adaptations between all organic beings, one with another and with their physical conditions of life, which may have been effected in the long course of time through nature's power of selection. And this has plagued evolutionary biologists. For instance, they question here, a quite general issue has still received no canonical treatment. What kind of thing is natural selection anyway? Is it a law, a principle, a force, a cause, an agent, or some of these things? One source of trouble was Darwin. He liked the term natural selection because it could be used as a substantive governing verb, because such uses appeared to ratify or even deify natural selection as an agent. So natural selection, just a final point, can only select, according to Darwin and other evolutionary theorists, natural selection can only select what has already been there. Again, it does not add new things. And this begs the question in the concept of mutations. So mutations are genetic copying errors of genetic information. So we've all played over the years when we were kids the telephone game where you have 20 people sitting in a circle and then one person is transmitting information to the next person, and by the time you get to the 20th person, the original information has changed. It's a great metaphor for copying errors. For decades of experiments have shown that DNA mutations do not produce beneficial new anatomical features, according to Dr. Jonathan Wells. If I was using the analogy of taking 10 steps backwards to basically represent negative mutations, and then if I was to take no steps forward or backwards to represent a neutral mutation, but then I took one step forward in a possible hypothetical positive mutation, I'm still 9 steps back, if I even give credence to the idea of a beneficial mutation. So these are other real-life examples of mutations using existing information but with copying errors. So there's a 5-legged bull, or we have this 2-headed turtle, or we have these mutant sheep that have short legs. These animals are not going to live long because they have mutations that have degraded their anatomy. From the letters of the word Christmas, you can get the words like has, Matt, Sam, Christ, Ram, Sat, Hit, etc. But you cannot get words like Xerox, zebra, or queen. That would require new information. Are any mutations beneficial? Well, evolutionary scientists have been quick to use the sickle cell anemia as beneficial positive mutations that keep people from getting malaria. However, that is like saying if I cut off my legs, I have found the benefit and a positive response to alleviate athlete's foot. There's big problems with that. Number one, I may not have to worry about athlete's foot anymore, but I just cut my legs off in the process. There's also theology problems with this natural selection concept. So if I held up this statue and said, this statue has the power to design, to select, it can pick what lives and what dies. This statue is the sole source of order and creates all creatures, big and small. The statue has developed all living creation in our biosphere. What would you call that? As Christians, we would call that an idol. And this is in 2010 in Scientific America, an evolutionary publication. They say the trick is, how do you talk about natural selection without implying the rigidity of law? We use it almost as an active participant, almost like a god. In fact, you could substitute the word God for natural selection in a lot of evolutionary writings, and you'd think you were listening to a theologian. It's a routine we know doesn't exist, but we teach it anyway. Genetic mutation and some active force choose the most favorable one. So they know this is an issue. And final pillar, pillar number 4, Darwin's concept of common ancestry, the tree of life, descent with modification. So Darwin's tree of life, depicted here in the middle slide, is basically all biology came from one place. But this is completely contrary to the doctrine of created kinds in the book of Genesis. What we see in the Bible is the biology of, instead of a tree, an orchard. So the dogs have always been dogs. The birds have always been birds. The frogs have always been frogs. Now you'll notice with the dinosaurs have always been dinosaurs, but about 4,500 years ago there was a flood. And the environment after the flood, the dinosaurs did not survive that after flood environment. But frogs have always continued to be frogs, and salamanders have continued to always be doctrine of the created kind. What does the fossil record actually show? Well, with the Cambrian explosion, it shows the doctrine of created kind, not common descent. So if you go to the Chicago Field Museum, you'll see these great depictions of the dinosaurs, for instance. But what is missing is where these dinosaurs originated from. Their common ancestor, it's not in the fossil record. What you're seeing is what Darwin talked about is sudden appearance. We're seeing a Cambrian explosion of life. And we see the same thing with birds. You see birds everywhere, but you see no common ancestor prior to the birds emerging in the fossil record. The Cambrian explosion shows the doctrine of created kinds, because with things like trilobites, paleontologists have found over 15,000 species. Ancestors? None. The fish, we found over 500,000 fish, but 0 common ancestors in the fossil record. Bats, over 1,000 have been found in the fossil record, 0 common ancestors. Seals, over 5,000. But there's no proposed evolutionary ancestor. And the pterosaurs, the great flying pterosaurs, over 1,000 have been collected, but not a single ancestor. What we see in the fossil record is abrupt appearance. Now, what you'll see in a lot of evolutionary textbooks is a lot of dotted lines, but that's imagination. The actual empirical evidence does not show the missing links. The next example is homology. So Darwin liked to use the example of the human, the dog, the bird, and the whale. You can see similar parts in these different organisms. And he said this is proof of common descent. But over on the far right on the slide, I'm going to quote this book by Byron Nelson in 1927. He said, "Seeing the similarity of plan in all the various churches, would any man be so foolish as to contend because of the churches evolved from one another, there's a common ancestor? Hardly. They were all made separately. They may have well been planned and constructed by one architect at one and the same time." Also, with common descent of homology, it's using a circular reasoning. So the common ancestor demonstrates homology, which demonstrates common ancestry. Another metaphor of using this, different shapes that are similar, is if I had a tennis ball and I held up a basketball and said, over long periods of time, this tennis ball has obviously evolved into this basketball because they look similar. And then I could extrapolate from that with logic that that basketball would, over long periods of time, become a moon. We obviously shake our heads at that, but that is the logic of homology. Dr. Jonathan Wells says, the phylogenetic tree cannot be constructed without homologies. But if we define homology in terms of common ancestry, we can't know whether features are homologous until we have the phylogenetic tree. So we get what we need, but we have to have it already. It's like an employer telling a job applicant that to get the job that she must be in a union, but she can't get in the union unless she's already has the job. And with homology, you have these similar parts, but that does not show a common ancestor. What it shows is a common designer, a common architect. And I just want to ask a question, right? If we had these living transitionals, if we came across these missing links, why don't we see them today? Why don't we see a half horse, half chicken? Now, I know this looks comical to some people, but I'm trying to make a point that we should, according to the logic of Darwin, we should see this in our observations. We should see birds that are turning into dogs or dogs that are turning into birds. We should see horses that are half amphibians. There should be transitional forms, and we just don't see them. So to sum up what we've just discussed, these 4 pillars, we've discussed change over time, we've discussed survival of the fittest, we've discussed natural selections, and we've talked about common descent, and with major issues with all 4 of these points. Now this begs the question, as a Christian, could God not just have used evolution? Well, from a scientific point of view, the key components of evolution, by definition, are unguided, purposeless, random, and now we could even say luck. That doesn't fit into, scientifically, the definition of how God would design. And number 2, scientifically, there are no uncontested transitional fossils. So if the fossil record is showing that this theory doesn't pan out, why as Christians would we believe this scientifically? From a theological point of view, this would create death before sin, which is a massive theological problem. And just the character of God is completely antithetical to using evolution over millions of years to create death and suffering and disease before finally creating the life that He designed and desired and described in the book of Genesis. So some resources, I always plug 2 books. Dr. Jonathan Wells' book in 2000, Icons of Evolution, I think is a must-read. It is tremendous. Also, Dr. Randy Galuza, he recently published the 20 Evolutionary Blunders book. It's a quick read. You can read it at a junior high level. Also, Icons of Evolution, you can as well. I have a website, epicflood.org, that if you have questions about the flood and geology or evolution, there are tons of different videos and podcasts you can listen to. There's also searchcreation.org, which is a great website you can go to, plug in your question. It's a free website and gives you tons of great answers. ICR, Institute of Research, Creation Research, has a great website, icr.org. And in Irving, here in DFW, there's a great Discovery Museum. It is in North Irving and Las Colinas. It is worth a visit. Thank you so much.